In the summer of 1944, German pilots had a nickname for the P-47 Thunderbolt. They called it a flying bathtub. Too big, too heavy, too slow to climb. Against sleek Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, the Thunderbolt looked like a mistake the Americans had refused to admit. Even some Allied pilots avoided it, convinced that if a dogfight turned tight, the P-47 would be the last aircraft still trying to turn when the bullets arrived. But high above Europe, one American pilot refused to listen. While others tried to fight German fighters the right way, he fought them a different way. He climbed higher, he waited longer, and when he finally attacked, he didn't turn. He fell. Out of the sun, out of thin air, out of reach. German pilots never saw him until their cockpits shattered. In a single month after D-Day, this one man would tear through the Luftwaffe so violently that enemy pilots began changing routes to avoid the Thunderbolt altogether. Aircraft vanished in the air, rows of fighters burned on their own runways, and the plane everyone laughed at became something far worse than feared. It became unstoppable. The pilot's name was Francis "Gabby" Gabreski, and the aircraft they mocked was about to rewrite air combat forever. By the time the Allied invasion of Europe was underway, air combat doctrines seemed settled. Fighters were supposed to be light, agile, and quick to climb. Speed mattered, but turning mattered more. Whoever could get inside the enemy's turn radius usually lived. Whoever couldn't, didn't. And by those standards, the P-47 Thunderbolt looked like a disaster waiting to happen. The aircraft was enormous for a single-engine fighter. Its massive Pratt & Whitney radial engine gave it a blunt, almost clumsy nose. Fully loaded, the P-47 weighed nearly twice as much as some German fighters. Pilots joked that it didn't fly so much as fall through the sky under control. Compared to the sleek Messerschmitt Bf-109 or the razor-sharp Focke-Wulf 190, the Thunderbolt looked outdated before it ever reached combat. German pilots noticed immediately. They mocked it openly. They laughed at its size. They called it slow. They believed, correctly, that if they could force a P-47 into a tight-turning fight, the American pilot was finished. The Luftwaffe had spent years refining close-in, high-performance dogfighting tactics. They trusted their aircraft to climb faster, turn tighter, and bleed less energy in combat. On paper, they were right. Early Allied losses seemed to confirm the fear. P-47 pilots struggled at lower altitudes. The aircraft's weight punished sloppy flying. Fuel limitations initially restricted escort range, leaving bombers exposed. Some American pilots quietly requested transfers to lighter fighters as soon as they could. The Thunderbolt earned an ugly reputation. Even within the U.S. Army Air Forces, confidence was shaky. Briefings emphasized caution. Manuals warned against prolonged turning engagements. Instructors stressed survival, not dominance. The aircraft was treated as a compromise, strong enough to escort bombers, tough enough to absorb damage, but never expected to rule the sky. And then there was the reality of 1944. After D-Day, the skies over France and Germany became brutally crowded. Bombers flew deep into enemy territory daily. Fighters clashed constantly. Pilots were exhausted. Losses mounted. The Luftwaffe, though weakened, was still lethal, especially at medium altitudes where many fights naturally developed. This was where the Thunderbolt was supposedly weakest. German pilots knew how to bait Allied fighters downward, dragging them into altitude bands where speed bled away and turning fights became deadly traps. Once a heavy aircraft lost its energy, recovery was nearly impossible. A single mistake could mean fire, metal tearing apart, and a long fall into Europe below. Everything about the situation screamed caution. So when word spread that one American pilot actively preferred the P-47, refused to give it up, even as others transitioned away, it raised eyebrows. When rumors followed that he wasn't just surviving, but actively hunting German fighters in it, many assumed the reports were exaggerated. No one expected what was coming next. Because the problem with the P-47 wasn't that it was weak. The problem was that everyone, on both sides, had been thinking about air combat the same way for years. They were all fighting the last war in the air. And high above Europe, in the thin, cold air where engines strained and mistakes became fatal, the stage was set for someone to realize that the Thunderbolt didn't need to win the fight everyone else was fighting. It needed to fight a different war entirely. Francis Stanley Gabreski didn't look like a revolutionary. He wasn't loud, he wasn't theatrical, and he didn't fit the popular image of the swaggering fighter ace chasing glory through the skies. Born in 1919 to Polish immigrant parents in Pennsylvania, Gabreski grew up with discipline before he ever found aviation. His home valued work, restraint, and precision. Mistakes were corrected quietly. Success was expected, not celebrated. That mindset followed him into adulthood, and eventually into the cockpit. Flying came naturally to him, but combat did not come with romantic illusions. From the beginning, Gabreski understood something many young pilots didn't. Air combat was not about courage alone. It was about judgment, timing, and not giving the enemy the fight they wanted. Before the United States entered the war, Gabreski was already restless. He wanted experience, real experience. So when the opportunity arose, he volunteered to fly with the Royal Air Force, not as a combat pilot, but as an observer. He watched British pilots fight and die over Europe. He listened to their debriefs. He learned what worked and what didn't. What struck him most wasn't heroism. It was how often pilots died by doing what everyone expected them to do. Turn fights, chases, instinctive reactions drilled into muscle memory. Gabreski noticed that the most successful pilots weren't necessarily the most aggressive. They were the most patient. They waited. They chose when to commit. And they avoided fights that offered no advantage. When he returned to American service and eventually found himself flying the P-47 Thunderbolt, that observation became critical. Other pilots saw the Thunderbolt's size and tried to compensate. They flew it like lighter fighters. They forced turns. They tried to prove it could do what the German aircraft did better. Gabreski didn't. He flew it like what it was. He paid attention to the way it moved through the air, the way it built speed, the way it held together under stress. He noticed how it behaved at altitude, where thinner air changed everything. Engine performance, control response, even pilot decision-making. And quietly, without announcing it to anyone, he began flying differently. Not recklessly, not experimentally, but deliberately. In briefings, Gabreski didn't talk much. He didn't challenge doctrine openly. He didn't argue with instructors or demand special treatment. He listened. He nodded. Then he went up and flew the mission his way. Other pilots noticed small things. Gabreski climbed higher than most. He disengaged faster than expected. He didn't chase damaged enemies downward. And he returned from missions with a calm expression that unsettled people more than bravado ever could. He wasn't hunting kills. He was hunting control. By early 1944, his reputation was quietly growing, but not loudly enough to attract myth. He wasn't a celebrity ace yet. He wasn't chasing headlines. He was simply consistent, survivable, effective. The Thunderbolt, meanwhile, was still being mocked. German pilots still laughed at its size. Allied pilots still worried about its limitations. The war in the air still followed the same patterns it always had. But Gabreski had learned something vital long before the first shot was fired in his most famous month. You don't win air combat by proving you're braver. You win it by choosing when the fight isn't fair. And soon, very soon, the skies over Europe were going to learn what happened when a pilot stopped flying the plane everyone wanted, and started flying the plane as it truly was. The realization didn't come all at once. There was no single epiphany, no dramatic moment where Francis Gabreski suddenly figured it out. Instead, the answer revealed itself slowly, through hours of flying, through quiet observation, through paying attention to what the P-47 did when no one was forcing it to be something else. Up high, where the air thinned and engines strained, the Thunderbolt behaved differently. Its massive turbo-supercharged engine didn't choke the way German fighters did. While Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs clawed for altitude and began to lose performance, the P-47 kept pulling. Heavy, yes, but steady, stable, unforgiving only if mishandled. And when the thunderbolt began to fall, it fell like nothing else in the sky. In a dive, the P-47 didn't just accelerate, it punched through the air. Gravity, weight, and raw horsepower combined into something German pilots weren't prepared for. At high speed, control surfaces remained responsive. The airframe held together when others would have torn themselves apart. Where lighter fighters hesitated, the Thunderbolt committed. Gabreski noticed this. More importantly, he trusted it. Instead of circling for position, he climbed. Instead of reacting, he waited. He stopped chasing fighters that wanted to drag him down. He refused turning engagements entirely. Every instinct drilled into pilots since training told him to engage, to press, to finish the fight. He ignored it. Gabreski began fighting the sky itself. From altitude, he watched. German fighters rose to intercept Allied formations below, confident in their climb rates and maneuverability. They searched for enemies at their level, never thinking to look straight up. By the time they realized someone was above them, it was already too late. Gabreski dove. Not to dogfight, not to turn, not to prove anything. He dove to kill. The Thunderbolt screamed as it accelerated, the airframe shuddering at the edge of compressibility. In seconds, Gabreski closed the distance at speeds German pilots couldn't match. He fired once, maybe twice, and was gone before the enemy could react. No chase, no turning, no second pass. He climbed back up, trading speed for altitude, resetting the fight entirely. This wasn't reckless aggression. It was discipline. Other pilots began to notice something unsettling in their gun camera footage. Enemy aircraft appeared suddenly, filled the frame for a heartbeat, and vanished. There were no swirling dogfights, no dramatic maneuvering, just brief, violent encounters that ended before they truly began. German pilots were confused. They tried to follow the Thunderbolt into dives and found themselves locked out, controls stiffening, airframes protesting, vision tunneling as speed overwhelmed them. Those who survived learned quickly. If a P-47 was above you, the fight was already lost. What made Gabreski's approach deadly wasn't just the tactic, it was his restraint. He didn't pursue victories that felt good. He pursued ones that were safe. He didn't linger. He didn't gamble. And because of that, he lived to fight again, and again, and again. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the Thunderbolt's reputation began to change. Pilots who once cursed its weight began asking how Gabreski flew it. Squadron mates started climbing higher. Turning fights became rarer. Briefings shifted. The aircraft hadn't changed, but how it was used had. The Luftwaffe felt it immediately. Intercept missions became riskier. Surprise attacks came from above without warning. German pilots who prided themselves on tactical superiority suddenly found themselves reacting, always reacting, to an enemy they couldn't catch and couldn't escape. By the time anyone fully understood what was happening, it was already spreading. The Thunderbolt wasn't slow. It wasn't clumsy. It wasn't useless. It was a weapon designed to punish mistakes from above. And Francis Gabreski had turned altitude into a killing ground. What followed next wasn't a lucky streak. It was something far more terrifying. It was repetition. After D-Day, the skies over Western Europe became a killing ground. Every day, bomber streams poured across the channel. Every day, German fighters clawed upward to meet them. And every day, the margin for survival shrank. Fuel was scarce. Experienced pilots were scarcer. The Luftwaffe was still dangerous, but it was fighting with its back to the wall. This was the moment Francis Gabreski had been waiting for. In June 1944, the air war accelerated beyond anything seen before. Missions came faster. Engagements were constant. There was no time to rest, no time to reset doctrine. Pilots flew, landed, refueled, and flew again. Fatigue crept into every decision, and fatigue created mistakes. Gabreski punished every one of them. He appeared where German pilots didn't expect enemies to be, high above the fight, patient, watching, waiting. And when he struck, It wasn't dramatic. It was final. One pass, one burst, one aircraft gone. Then he climbed back into the safety of altitude, already searching for the next opening. Days blurred together. Victories stacked up. Enemy aircraft fell not just in the air, but on the ground, caught lined up on airfields during strafing runs, engines burning, pilots scrambling too late. German units began dispersing aircraft, hiding them under trees, camouflaging runways, clear signs of fear. Radio chatter changed. German pilots began calling out warnings when they saw thunderbolts above them. Escort fighters hesitated to climb. Interceptors broke off attacks early rather than risk being caught from above. The psychological balance of the air war shifted, not because the Luftwaffe was gone, but because it could no longer fight with confidence. Within weeks, Gabreski's name began circulating quietly through enemy channels. Not shouted, not celebrated, whispered. American pilots noticed it too. They watched how Gabreski flew, how he disengaged without ego, how he returned from missions intact while others limped home, or didn't come back at all. His score climbed steadily, almost methodically. By July 1944, he was on a streak that defied belief. Aircraft destroyed in quick succession, multiple victories in single days, a pace so relentless that it forced Allied commanders to reevaluate what they were seeing. This wasn't chance. This wasn't luck. It was a system, applied perfectly, again and again. But the very thing that made Gabreski lethal also pushed him toward the edge. As the month wore on, the temptation to press grew stronger. The enemy was breaking. German airfields were exposed. Every destroyed aircraft on the ground was one less threat to the bombers tomorrow. The risk felt acceptable. The reward felt necessary. On one mission, Gabreski dove low, too low. He attacked an enemy airfield, guns blazing, ripping across the runway at treetop height. Flak erupted, fire tore through the air, and then, suddenly, everything went wrong. His P-47 took hits, the engine faltered, smoke filled the cockpit. There would be no climb this time. Gabreski fought the controls, nursing what power remained, searching for any chance to escape. But altitude was gone. Speed was bleeding away. The sky that had protected him for weeks had finally slipped out of reach. He crash-landed in enemy territory. When the dust settled, Gabreski was alive, but the fight was over. German soldiers surrounded the wreckage. The Thunderbolt lay broken in a field, its massive frame torn apart at last, not by enemy fighters, but by the ground itself. Gabreski was taken prisoner. His war in Europe abruptly ended. Behind him, the air war continued. But it continued differently now. The Thunderbolt was no longer a joke, no longer underestimated, no longer flown timidly. Pilots climbed higher. They avoided turning fights. They dove, struck, and escaped. Gabreski's month in the sky had changed behavior, on both sides. The Luftwaffe had lost more than aircraft. It had lost control of the fight. And though Francis Gabreski would never fly another combat mission over Europe, the method he proved in blood and aluminum would outlive the war itself. What remained now was the question every great conflict leaves behind. What does one man's way of fighting change when the war finally ends? When Francis Gabreski was pulled from the wreckage of his Thunderbolt and taken into captivity, the war in Europe continued without him. The skies remained crowded. Bombers still burned. Pilots still died. But something fundamental had changed. The P-47 Thunderbolt was no longer treated as a compromise. It was treated as a weapon. By the time the war ended, Gabreski was credited with 28 confirmed aerial victories, making him the highest-scoring American ace in the European theater. That number alone would have secured his place in history, but it wasn't the statistic that mattered most. What mattered was how those victories were achieved. Gabreski didn't win by bending the Thunderbolt into something it wasn't. He didn't demand lighter wings or tighter turns. He didn't fight the airplane's design. He embraced it. And in doing so, he helped reshape how American fighters were flown, not just in 1944, but for decades afterward. The Thunderbolt's reputation flipped almost overnight. Once mocked as too heavy and too slow, it became feared for its diving speed, its survivability, and its brutal firepower. Pilots trusted it to bring them home riddled with holes that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. Ground crews joked that if the engine was still attached, the plane would fly. German pilots stopped laughing. Post-war accounts from Luftwaffe veterans spoke openly about Thunderbolts dropping out of the sun, striking once, and disappearing before a response was possible. They learned to respect altitude. They learned to fear vertical attacks. They learned, too late, that turning skill meant nothing if the enemy never turned with you. Gabreski returned to the United States after the war quietly. There were ceremonies. There were interviews. But he never chased celebrity. Like many combat pilots, he carried the war inside him rather than wearing it on his sleeve. What makes his story even rarer is what came next. When war broke out in Korea, Gabreski returned to combat, this time in jets. Once again, he adapted faster than doctrine. Once again, he refused to fight the enemy's fight. And once again, he became an ace. Very few pilots in history achieved that distinction in two different wars. But even that achievement traces back to the same principle he discovered over Europe in 1944. Technology doesn't win wars by itself. People do, when they understand it better than the enemy. Today, the P-47 Thunderbolt is remembered as one of the greatest fighters of World War II. Museums celebrate it. Historians praise its design. Aviation enthusiasts marvel at its power and durability. But that reputation wasn't inevitable. It was earned, one dive at a time, by pilots who refused to accept what everyone else believed was obvious. And among them, Francis Gabreski stands apart. Not because he was reckless, not because he was loud, but because he was patient. He waited. He chose his moment. And he turned altitude into inevitability. In the end, the Thunderbolt didn't need to outturn its enemies. It didn't need to outclimb them. It didn't need to be lighter or prettier or faster on paper. It only needed one pilot who understood that the sky itself could be a weapon. They laughed at his airplane, until it became the last thing they ever saw.